Hello Proponomics people, and welcome to the longer form video from the Proponomics Advent Calendar 2023, the 11th of December, and this one is about ROI versus ROCE versus IRR. So all those letters and all that jargon, what do they mean? Well, ROI is quite simple. It means return on investment. ROCE is return on capital employed. And then IRR, which is the one you might not have heard of if you're familiar with some of the property investment jargon, is the internal rate of return. I'm going to talk a bit about the advantages and disadvantages of those metrics and how they compare with each other. So the first thing I should say is, unfortunately, there's no silver bullets, right? There are no one metric solutions, one size fits all. And by the end of the video, you'll find out which one I favour and why. But every metric is going to have advantages and disadvantages. ROI, if we start with really the simplest one, return on investment. And the fact that it's simple, of course, is an advantage in itself. It's easy to calculate, and that's why it's so widely used. What return are you going to get on your investment? So you're going to have to consider, of course, a number of things in that. Are we just looking at the gross return, for example, which is often the way? ROI is often just completely confused with the yield on a property. So when we look at yield, we might say, well, look, there's a 100k property that gets £7,000 a year's worth of rent. So really simply, there's a 7% yield, but actually there's a 7% gross yield. How useful is that metric? If it costs us £10,000 a year to run that property and pay the mortgage on it, is that any good? Well, you wouldn't think so, because we're losing £3,000 a year. But even then, that might not be a problem if it's going up in value by 10% every year and we're actually gaining £10,000 on paper. So you start to see some of the weaknesses of just looking at the simplicity of a metric like return on investment. So it also doesn't consider the timing of cash flows, which can be important, because what's the one thing that ever sends a business bankrupt? Well, it's cash flow problems. So ROCE is generally the next step upwards, the next concept that's introduced when it comes to property investment metrics, and that stands for return on capital employed. So that is going to look more at how much have you got left in a deal once you have refinanced. So if you're following something that looks like a momentum model, or what's more popularly called BRR or equivalent these days, then you might be considering the return on capital employed. What would the gold standard look like? Well, let's say you bought a house for 50k, you spent 25k on all the frictional costs and the legals and doing it up and bridging and goodness knows what else you might need. And then at the end of that, it was worth 100k, and you could release 75k with a 75% loan to value mortgage. Now, obviously that's a simplistic example, but that would mean you've got no money left in that deal. And that would mean you actually had an infinite ROCE, because you haven't employed any capital anymore. And that also highlights a little bit of the weakness of the metric of ROCE, because let's say you did even better than that and you were in for 70k on the same property and pulled out 75 on a 75% mortgage. Well, then you would have capital employed of minus £5,000. So you would actually have a negative ROCE, even though that would mean it was a great investment. But not every ROCE that's negative would mean it was great, because it's a fraction, and all a negative fraction means is either the top or the bottom are negative. So it might be that you have a negative return on the property and you've got lots of money stuck left in it, and then you'd also have a negative ROCE. So you can see where that could potentially cause you a problem. Now, it can also be very sensitive, ROCE, to what happens with the valuation. For example, well, if you have a down val, even though you think the property is worth more money, then you might well end up with capital stuck in the deal you didn't think was going to happen. It really is only a cross-sectional metric in time that can help you make a decision at the start of a project. Does it matter what the return on capital employed is when you're 6 years into the lifespan of a property investment? I would argue that it doesn't. Hopefully you haven't got any capital employed by that point, because you've had all your money back from rents and have made a profit, or at least paid down the deposit that you put in the first place. Is it fair to compare a property you've owned for 6 years with a property you've owned for 6 minutes using ROCE? No, it's not. It's not a good comparable metric. So then I'll move on to IRR, the internal rate of return. As I say, it's the one that might be less familiar to people in the property community, but it's equally, if not more important. And the internal rate of return is going to look at ultimately all of the cash flows you think you're going to get out of that project for the lifespan of the whole of the asset's life. So it might be that you're intending to hold this property for 25 years, or some people say the ideal time span is forever. So 25 years worth of rents that are going to increase over time, and then ultimately potentially some refinances in there which are going to impact cash flows but not returns, but also some paper growth in the asset that you'll only realise when you sell the asset. Although, as I say, you might be able to access some of that cash by refinancing. So you're going to have cash flows that are impacting due to rents coming in, due to potentially maintenance and other monies, management fees and the likes going out. And then you're also going to have the capital growth element to it. But what IRR does is it brings all that together into an annualised figure. So you're looking at one annualised figure over the lifespan of a project. And that is going to inform you as to whether you are going to potentially hold that asset for a long time or even buy that asset in the first place. And then what we'll also talk about around that in the next video is around discounted cash flow, because that's related to the concept of IRR, and also the concept around capital growth and where we see rates of return, tax efficiency, and all the rest of it for property investors. So thanks for listening, and see you tomorrow.